appears on cracked stone. Panorama of Akkad, the rise and fall of ancient Mesopotamia. They called it the cradle of civilization, where kings claimed to rule the world and gods walked among men. But in less than 2 centuries, it vanished. This is not just the story of Akkad's rise. It's a warning from 4,000 years ago. A superpower that soared, collapsed, and was forgotten until now. What really destroyed the empire that conquered Sumer? Was it famine, rebellion, or something even more chilling? Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to the very beginning of civilization itself. We're going to a time so ancient, the Great Pyramids of Giza were still thousands of years in the future. We're heading to the land between 2 rivers, to the dusty, sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, to witness the birth, the breathtaking peak, and the dramatic collapse of the world's very first empire, Akkad. Imagine a world waking up for the first time, where the idea of a king is new, the act of writing is magic, and cities are a radical, untested experiment. The air is thick with the smoke of sacrificial offerings and the scent of irrigated fields. Honestly, given the complete absence of antibiotics, plumbing, and a reliable food supply, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than a week, but the view is something else. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always fun to see where everyone is listening from, so feel free to post your city, your country, and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes. Or don't, but just let your focus soften. The world around you melts away. The gentle hum of the fan becomes the whisper of wind through an endless sea of reeds. You're standing now, not on solid ground, but on a squelching, muddy floodplain somewhere in what will one day be called Southern Iraq. The year is, well, there is no year. We are in a time before calendars, before history has a name for itself. Let's call it 6000 BCE, give or take a few centuries. The air you're breathing is heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the sweet green scent of crushed reeds. A hazy, white-hot sun beats down from a pale blue sky, and the heat shimmers above the waterlogged ground. This is the cradle of civilization, but right now it doesn't look like much of a cradle. It looks more like a sprawling, untamed swamp. This is the land that will be known as Sumer. To your east, you can just make out the sluggish, brown ribbon of a great river. To your west, another. These are the Tigris and the Euphrates, the 2 arteries that give this land its life and its name. Mesopotamia literally means the land between the rivers. For millennia, these rivers have been carrying rich, nutrient-dense silt down from the northern mountains. Each spring, they swell with snowmelt, overflowing their banks in violent, unpredictable floods that drown the landscape. It's a destructive force for sure. But when the waters recede, they leave behind a gift, a layer of dark, miraculously fertile soil in a region that is otherwise a harsh, arid desert. This is the simple, powerful engine of our story. You're not alone here. There are people, small groups, living in strange, rounded huts woven from the very reeds that surround you. They move with a quiet purpose, their skin tanned dark by the relentless sun. These are not yet the Sumerians of legend. These are their predecessors, a people archaeologists have named the Akkad culture. They are pioneers, learning to tame this wild landscape. They've figured out that if you dig a simple trench from the river to a patch of dry land, you can control the water. You can bring life to the desert. This is irrigation, the single most important invention in this part of the world, and it's happening right before your eyes. It's not a grand eureka moment. It's a slow, painstaking process of trial and error carried out over generations. For every successful canal, there are dozens that silt up, collapse, or flood at the wrong time. It's a constant, back-breaking battle against the mud. A bit like trying to assemble flat-pack furniture with instructions written in a language you don't understand. You watch as a man expertly pilots a small, canoe-like boat called a coracle, made from reeds and sealed with black sticky bitumen that seeps from the ground here. He's fishing with a net, and his haul is good, a flash of silver scales in the afternoon light. Women nearby are grinding grain, rhythmic scraping of stone on stone. They are the first farmers, the first brewers of a coarse, nourishing beer, the first settlers to decide that staying in one place might be better than constantly wandering. Historians still argue whether the people who would become the great Sumerian civilization were descendants of these Akkad people, or if they were migrants who arrived later, perhaps from the east, drawn by the growing fertility of this land. The transition is murky, lost in the unwritten millennia. All we know is that a new culture, a new language, and a new way of thinking is slowly taking root in this mud. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the marsh, you notice something odd. In the center of a slightly larger cluster of reed and mud brick huts, a more substantial building is taking shape. It's being built on a raised platform of packed earth, an attempt to lift it above the floodwaters. This isn't a home. It has a different feel, a sense of shared importance. This is the first glimmer of a temple. It's a focal point for the small community, a place to store communal grain, to make offerings to the formless, terrifying spirits of the sky, the water, and the earth. The spirits who bring the life-giving floods, but also the devastating droughts, the swarms of locusts, and the sickness that can sweep through a village overnight. The people here believe the world was born from a chaotic, primeval sea, and looking around at this watery landscape, you can absolutely see why. It's a worldview shaped entirely by their environment. The mosquitoes are starting to come out now, and they are, shall we say, of a biblical proportion. You can understand why early Mesopotamian medical texts would later include remedies for bites and stings that involve things like, well, let's just say ingredients you wouldn't find in a modern pharmacy. As darkness falls, the only light comes from small fires and the brilliant, unobscured canopy of stars. It's a silence so profound it's almost loud, punctuated only by the croaking of frogs and the distant howl of a jackal. It is in this immense quiet, in this fertile mud, that the seeds of everything to come are being planted. The first villages are growing, slowly, organically, like the reeds themselves. They are learning to cooperate, to plan, to build something together that might just last. And soon, one of these villages will grow bigger than all the others, becoming something the world has never seen before. The night in the reed marshes gives way to a hazy dawn. The air cools just for a moment before the sun begins its relentless climb. We're moving forward in time now, maybe 1,000 years or more, to around 4000 BC. The small, scattered villages of the Akkad people have grown. The canals are wider, more complex. The fields are larger, greener, more orderly. But something else is happening. One of these settlements is growing faster than the others, drawing people in from the surrounding countryside like a slow-motion whirlpool. You leave the relative quiet of the fields and head towards this burgeoning hub. The trickle of people walking alongside you becomes a stream, then a river of humanity. This is Uruk, and it is arguably the first true city on planet Earth. The first thing that hits you is the sheer, overwhelming scale of it. From a distance, it looks like a giant, messy termite mound shimmering in heat. As you get closer, you see the wall. A massive defensive wall of baked mud bricks, said to be 6 miles long and dotted with hundreds of defensive towers. According to legend, this monumental task was ordered by a king named Gilgamesh, a figure who would become the world's first literary hero. Right now, though, he's just the boss of the world's biggest, muddiest construction site. The wall is a statement. It separates the world inside, the organized, protected, human world, from the chaos and wilderness outside. You pass through a gateway, and the sensory assault is immediate. The gentle hum of the marshes is replaced by a deafening cacophony. There's the rhythmic thud of workers pounding mud into wooden molds to make bricks, the bleating of countless sheep and goats being herded through the narrow streets, the shouting of foremen, the haggling of merchants in a dozen different dialects, and the constant murmur of thousands upon thousands of people living their lives packed tightly together. The air is thick with dust, the smell of wood smoke from cooking fires, a pungent aroma of livestock, and an undercurrent of something less pleasant. Uruk's canals, which brought fresh water in, also served as the city's sewer system. It's a unique bouquet that would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot. This isn't just a big village anymore. This is a different kind of organism entirely. At its peak, Uruk was home to an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's more people than lived in classical Athens or medieval London. For the ancient world, this was a megacity, and it demanded a new way of life. Out in the country, everyone was a farmer. Here, you see specialization everywhere. You pass a workshop where potters are not just making simple pots, but are using a new invention, the potter's wheel, to churn out ceramics with astonishing speed and uniformity. You see stonemasons, weavers, brewers, and boat builders. And you see a new class of people entirely, priests and administrators, their robes cleaner than most, moving with an air of authority. The city is a chaotic maze of winding, unpaved streets, most of them just wide enough for two people and maybe a stubborn donkey to pass. The houses are packed together, windowless boxes made of sun-dried mud brick, their entrances opening onto shared courtyards. It's an urban planner's nightmare, but it works. Everyone is here for a reason. Historians still argue whether this explosive urbanization was a willing choice for rural people seeking opportunity, or a form of coercion by the growing temple elite who needed labor for their monumental projects. Was Uruk a shining beacon of progress, or a vast, dusty labor camp? The truth is probably somewhere in between. As you navigate the crowds, you notice something ubiquitous. Lying discarded everywhere in piles in the dirt are crudely made, thick-walled bowls. They are all exactly the same size and shape. Archaeologists call them bevel-rimmed bowls, and they have found hundreds of thousands of them. They are the single most common artifact from this period. The prevailing theory is that these were standardized ration bowls. The temple authorities, who control the grain stores, would hand out daily portions of barley or oil to the city's vast workforce in these disposable containers. It's the world's first standardized food measurement, a kind of clay pay stub proving the existence of a massive, centrally controlled economy. It's like finding the ancient equivalent of styrofoam takeout containers. Dominating the flat skyline are two enormous temple complexes, the hearts of the city. One is the Anu district, topped by the White Temple, built on a massive 40-foot high mud brick platform, a man-made mountain called a ziggurat. It was painted white with gypsum plaster, so it would have blazed in the sun, a beacon visible for miles across the plain. The other complex, and the more important one, is the Yana district, dedicated to the city's patron goddess Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. This was not just a religious center. It was the economic and administrative core of the city-state. It was Uruk's central bank, its government headquarters, and its main warehouse all rolled into one. Here, the priests and scribes wrestle with a problem no one in history had ever faced before. How do you keep track of all this? How do you record the thousands of bushels of grain coming in, the hundreds of thousands of ration bowls going out, the herds of temple-owned sheep, the tribute from surrounding villages? The human memory is no longer enough. The sheer scale of Uruk is forcing the invention of something that will change the world forever. So, here you are, standing in the shadow of the great Yana temple complex, the administrative heart of Uruk. The problem facing the priests and scribes here is one of data management. How do you stop a shepherd from, shall we say, misplacing a few temple-owned sheep? How do you ensure the grain being paid out in those bevel-rimmed bowls we saw earlier actually matches the grain that was brought in at harvest time? The answer is in your hands. A scribe, seeing your curious expression, hands you a lump of cool, damp, finely sifted river clay. It's about the size and shape of an early, chunky smartphone. He also gives you a sharpened reed, its tip cut into a neat triangular wedge. This is the solution. This is writing. In its earliest form, it's not poetry or grand history, it's accounting. The scribe demonstrates, pressing the reed into the clay. He makes a simple drawing, a pictograph, a stalk of barley. Next to it, he makes a series of simple circular impressions. 1 stalk of barley, 10 units. A record has been made. It's simple, but it's revolutionary. Over the next few centuries, you can almost see the system evolving and fast forward. The pictures become more abstract, faster to draw. The curved lines become straight, wedge-shaped marks. This is the birth of cuneiform, one of the world's first scripts, named for the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge. It's less like drawing and more like a complex system of stamping. Trying to learn it would be like trying to master the most complicated video game controller ever designed. But for these scribes, it's second nature. Once a tablet is inscribed, it's left to bake in the sun, turning it into a permanent, rock-hard record. The original filing cabinet was just a dusty shelf full of these clay tablets. The Sumerian HR department would have been a very noisy, dusty place. To sign a document or mark a bale of goods, a person would use a cylinder seal. This was a small, intricately carved stone cylinder that, when rolled over wet clay, left a unique, repeating pattern. It was a combination signature and security tag. Scholars continue to debate the exact ritualistic meaning behind some of the more abstract scenes depicted on these seals, but their practical function was clear. In a world of growing anonymity, this little stone object proved you were you. But who were they doing all this work for? The answer was the gods. The Sumerians believed that humanity was created for one purpose: to serve the gods and free them from the drudgery of work. The city wasn't just a place for people. It was the earthly estate of its patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna. The city of Uar belonged to the moon god Nana. Nippur, the great religious center, belonged to the head of the pantheon, Enlil. These gods were not distant, ethereal beings. They were deeply, amusingly human. They had titanic egos, they held grudges, they fell in love, and they got into colossal, world-shaking squabbles. And most importantly, they needed to be fed, clothed, and housed in their temples. They also had a powerful thirst. Which brings us to beer. The Sumerians loved beer. It was a divine gift, the drink of the gods themselves. It was also a staple of the daily diet, a thick, nutritious, porridge-like brew, probably safer to drink than water from the bacteria-rich canals. A mainstream historical fact is that workers were often paid their wages in barley and beer. The bevel-rimmed bowls likely held grain rations, but other records show clear beer rations being allocated. There was even a goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, and the hymn to Ninkasi is one of the oldest pieces of literature in the world. It's a beautiful piece of poetry, but it's also, quite literally, a recipe for brewing beer. It's like finding a sacred text that's also a Betty Crocker cookbook. The gods, it was thought, could get quite cranky if their beer deliveries were late, so keeping the divine liquor cabinet stocked was a matter of cosmic importance. You walk past a tavern, or at least the Sumerian equivalent. It's a courtyard where people sit on low stools, sipping the cloudy brew from large jars through long straws, designed to bypass the bits of grain and chaff floating on the top. It's a social hub, a place to gossip and unwind after a long day of making mud bricks or digging canals under the punishing sun. The Sumerians had a whole pantheon of hundreds of deities, but in daily life, they probably focused on their personal god, a sort of low-level divine patron who might, if properly appeased, put in a good word for you with the bigger, more important gods. They also believed in all manner of demons and ghosts that could cause misfortune and illness. A quirky tidbit is their belief in a specific demon named Lamashtu, a terrifying hybrid creature who was thought to prey on pregnant women and newborn infants, leading to a whole industry of protective amulets and incantations. Life here is a complex tapestry of hard work, intricate bureaucracy, and deep, pervasive religious belief. The temple at the city's heart is not just a place of worship. It's the engine of the entire economy, and writing is the oil that keeps its gears turning. This entire system, the specialized labor, the centralized agriculture, the divine justification, allowed Uruk and other Sumerian cities like Uar, Eridu, and Lagash to flourish. But it also created intense competition. Each city was its own independent kingdom, a city-state fiercely proud and protective of its god, its water rights, and its territory. And as these city-states grew more powerful, their proximity to one another on this flat, featureless plain made conflict almost inevitable. The very walls built to keep the wilderness out would soon be used to fend off their neighbors. The walls you saw being built around Uruk and the other great cities were not just for show, and not just to keep out the wild beasts of the plains. As these city-states grew in wealth and power, the competition for land, for water, and for divine favor became lethally intense. The history of Sumer in the centuries leading up to our story is a history of near-constant warfare. Think of it as the most violent, high-stakes sports league imaginable, where neighboring cities like Umma and Lagash had a rivalry that makes modern football hooligans look like a book club. Their feud was ancient, bloody, and centered on a contested strip of fertile farmland between them. For generations, they fought over this single patch of dirt. We know this in vivid detail because of a monument called the Stele of the Vultures. It's a carved limestone slab, one of the first ever visual war memorials, and it was commissioned by a king of Lagash to commemorate a victory over Umma. It's a chilling piece of propaganda. On one side, you see the god of Lagash, Ningirsu, holding a net full of the captured, struggling soldiers of Umma. On the other, you see the army of Lagash in a tight, disciplined formation called a phalanx, heavy shields interlocked, long spears bristling forward. It's the first clear depiction of organized infantry warfare. And then you see the grisly aftermath, the namesake vultures flying away with the severed heads of the defeated enemy. It's a brutal, clear message: we won. The gods are on our side. And this is what happens to our enemies. For a long time, Lagash had the upper hand. But then a new ruler, a new Ensi, rose to power in the humiliated city of Umma. His name was Lugalzajizi. He was ambitious, charismatic, and he was tired of his city being the perennial loser. He nursed that grudge, and when he was ready, he didn't just reclaim the disputed territory. He launched an all-out assault on Lagash itself. He sacked the city, burned its temples, and in a final act of desecration, destroyed its sacred monuments, likely shattering the very steel of the vultures that had gloated over his ancestors. It was a shocking reversal of fortune, a complete upending of the regional power balance. But Lugalzajizi wasn't finished. Conquering his city's ancient rival had given him a taste for something more. He looked around the plains of Sumer and saw not a collection of independent cities, but a single land, the land of the Sumerians, ripe for the taking. He turned his victorious army south and west, and one by one, the great cities fell under his control. He conquered Uruk, the ancient heart of civilization, and was so impressed by its prestige that he moved his capital there. He took Ur, the center of the moon god's cult. He subdued nearly every major Sumerian city, creating a unified kingdom that stretched across the entire floodplain. He was the first Sumerian ruler to truly unite the land under a single banner. He gave himself a grand new title, Lugal-Kalam, king of a land. In his inscriptions, he boasts that his god Enlil had given him dominion from the lower sea to the upper sea, that is, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. It was almost certainly an exaggeration, a bit of royal bravado. It's unlikely his armies actually marched all the way to the coast of modern-day Lebanon. But the boast itself shows a new scale of thinking, a vision that went beyond the walls of a single city. However, historians still debate whether Lugalzajizi's empire was a centrally controlled state like the one that would follow, or merely a loose confederation of conquered cities, each resentfully paying him tribute while waiting for a chance to rebel. He had united Sumer, but the unity was only as strong as his army. Imagine him now, at the absolute zenith of his power. He resides in the palace at Uruk, the most powerful man in the known world. Before making a major decision, like whether to invade a neighboring territory or when to begin a new canal project, he would rely on a very specific and peculiar form of magic. This is our quirky tidbit, hepatoscopy, or liver divination. A priest, a baru, would sacrifice a perfectly healthy sheep. He would then carefully remove its liver and read it like a map to the future. The organ was seen as a tablet upon which the gods wrote their intentions. Every marking, every discoloration, every variation in the shape of the lobes had a specific meaning, codified in vast clay model libraries. There were clay models of sheep livers covering cuneiform inscriptions, detailing what this bump or that hole meant. If the path is forked, the campaign will not succeed. If the presence is dark, the king will fall ill. It was a divine message written in awful, and for king like Ligulzagizi, it was as crucial as any intelligence report. So you can see him anxious, awaiting the priest's verdict before launching his next campaign. For 25 years, the livers were good. The signs were favorable. He defeated his enemies, consolidated his power, and became the master of Sumer. He had achieved what no king before him ever had. He stands atop the ziggurat of Uruk, looking out over the lands he commands, feeling secure, chosen by the gods. The world is his. But he's blissfully unaware of a storm gathering in the north. In the relatively unimportant city of Kish, a man with no royal blood, a man who, according to legend, was a humble cupbearer to the king, is beginning to make a name for himself. A Semitic-speaking outsider in a Sumerian world. And the gods, it seems, are about to start writing very different messages on their bloody tablets. Will leave the powerful Ligulzagizi to his divinely sanctioned rule in Uruk and travel north, upriver, into the region known as Akkad. Here, the language is different. The people speak a Semitic tongue, Akkadian, not Sumerian. The cultures have mingled for centuries, but there's a distinct feel to this land. It's a bit rougher, less ancient than the great cities of the south. We find ourselves in the city of Kish, a place with its own long and proud history, but one that has been eclipsed by the southern powers. And here, in the court of the king of Kish, Yuarzababa, we find our protagonist. But he isn't a king. He isn't a prince or a general. He's a cupbearer. His name is Sargon. Now, Sargon is not the name he was born with. It's a throne name he'll adopt later, Sherakin, which means the true king or the legitimate king. The very name is a piece of political propaganda, a clue that his actual claim to power was, shall we say, a bit shaky. And the story he told about his own origins, or the story that was told about him, is one of the most famous and enduring in all of ancient history. It's a masterpiece of personal branding. Picture this, a baby born in secret. His mother is a high priestess and to priestess for whom childbirth was forbidden, a scandal that could have meant her death. She cannot keep the child. So in desperation, she weaves a small basket out of reeds, seals it tight with bitumen, that same black tar we saw being used on boats in the marshes centuries ago, and places her newborn son inside. She sets the basket afloat on the Euphrates River, abandoning him to the gods and the current. It's a scene of heartbreaking desperation. But the river is kind. The basket doesn't sink. It floats downstream until it's snagged in the branches of a willow tree, where it's discovered by a man named Aki, who is a humble gardener or, in some versions, a drawer of water. Aki rescues the baby, raises him as his own son, and names him. Well, we don't know his birth name. It's lost to history. Does this story sound familiar? It should. It's a classic, powerful archetype, the hero of humble or mysterious birth, saved from the water, destined for greatness. The story of Moses and the bulrushes, written more than 1,000 years later, has stunning parallels. So do the legends of the Indian hero Karna and the Roman founders Romulus and Remus. It's a tale that taps into a deep human need for our great figures to be chosen, touched by fate. A mainstream historical fact is that this Sargon birth legend, as it's known, is one of the world's oldest surviving examples of royal autobiography, even if it's almost certainly fiction. It was a story designed to legitimize his rule. It erased his real, likely unremarkable, past and replaced it with a narrative of divine intervention. If the gods themselves saved him from the river, who would dare question his right to the throne? So, back in the court of Kish, this young man, the supposed foundling, rises through the ranks. He becomes the royal cupbearer. This job title sounds trivial to us, maybe like a glorified waiter. But in the ancient world, it was a position of immense trust and intimacy. The cupbearer was the last person to handle the king's drink, making him the ultimate defense against poison. He was privy to the king's private conversations, a close and constant advisor. He was the king's confidant. And according to the legend, King Uarzababa of Kish starts having disturbing dreams that foretell Sargon's rise. The king grows fearful of his ambitious young servant. He tries to get rid of Sargon, first by sending him to the forge with a request for the smiths to murder him, and then by sending him on a deadly mission to Libel-Zajizi in Uruk, carrying his own death warrant sealed in a clay envelope. This part of the story, with its fairy tale-like attempts to dispatch the hero, is where the historical record blurs completely into myth. We don't know the details of how it happened. Historians still argue whether Sargon led a popular uprising, staged a clever palace coup, or simply stepped into a power vacuum left by a weak king. All we know is that somehow the gardener's son, the cupbearer, took the throne of Kish. Now he is king of a second-tier city. But Sargon's ambition, like Libel-Zajizi's before him, is boundless. He looks south to the rich, ancient cities of Sumer, currently united under the rule of the very man his old boss sent him to. The final showdown is inevitable. Libel-Zajizi, the great king of Uruk, the master of Sumer, versus Sargon, the upstart from the north, the man with no name and a story about a basket. Before we witness that clash, let's pause on a quirky detail of courtly life. The king's trust in his cupbearer was paramount because poison was a very real political tool. While sophisticated chemical poisons were unknown, there were plenty of natural toxins available. A lesser-known Mesopotamian fear was not just poison in a cup, but curses delivered through food and drink. They believed that a witch or sorcerer could imbue an object with malevolent magic. Special incantations and rituals were performed to purify the king's meals, not just from physical contaminants, but from spiritual ones as well. So Sargon's role as cupbearer wasn't just about preventing assassination by hemlock. It was also about being a magical shield, a guardian against bad juju. Perhaps this deep-seated fear of unseen threats is what made the story of his own miraculous, God-protected infancy so powerful and so necessary. He wasn't just a man who seized power. He was a man who, from birth, was immune to the dark forces that could bring down lesser kings. He was building his own legend, one clay tablet at a time. The stage is now set for a conflict that will reshape the world. In the south, you have Libel-Zajizi, the seasoned Sumerian king, ruler of a united land, secure in his capital at Uruk. In the north, you have Sargon, the Akkadian usurper from Kish, brimming with ambition and military savvy. The coming war wasn't just a clash of two men. It was a clash of cultures, the old, traditional Sumerian city-states against a new, dynamic, Semitic-speaking power from the north. Sargon doesn't wait to be attacked. He gathers his army and marches south. His forces are different from the Sumerian armies we saw on the steel of the vultures. While the Sumerians relied on the dense, slow-moving phalanx of spearmen, Sargon seems to have favored more mobile tactics. He incorporated large numbers of archers, using a powerful new weapon, the composite bow. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it could shoot arrows faster, farther, and with more penetrating power than a simple wooden bow. This allowed him to soften up the enemy formations from a distance before his infantry even made contact. It was a technological and tactical advantage that the Sumerians were unprepared for. The first major confrontation is a massive battle right outside the walls of Uruk. The inscriptions tell us that Sargon was victorious, utterly smashing the army of Libel-Zajizi. The text claims he was victorious in 34 battles in total, a number that likely represents a series of major campaigns rather than individual skirmishes. After the decisive field victory, he captures Libel-Zajizi himself. And in a moment of supreme, calculated humiliation, Sargon does not execute him on the spot. Instead, he puts the great king of the land in a dog collar and forces him to walk in chains to the city of Nippur, the holiest site in Sumer. He parades his defeated rival before the gate of the temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. The message was brutally clear. Your king has been humbled, and his god Enlil has now chosen me. Sargon wasn't just conquering land. He was co-opting the enemy's religion for his own purposes. With Lugal-Zagizi defeated and humiliated, the Sumerian alliance collapses. But the cities do not simply surrender. Sargon has to conquer them one by one. His campaign is a brutal, systematic sweep through the south. He lays siege to Uruk, and his inscription state he tore down its walls. He marches on Uar, home of the wealthy moon god cult, and does the same. He fights the forces of Lagash and its ally Umma, those ancient rivals now united against a common enemy, and defeats them, washing his weapons in the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, a symbolic act of reaching the end of the known world. This is a new kind of warfare. Before, wars were often fought to settle a border dispute or to force a rival city to pay tribute. The goal was domination. Sargon's goal was incorporation. He didn't just want to defeat these cities. He wanted to absorb them into a single political entity under his direct control. To do this, he needed to break their independent spirit, and the most potent symbol of that independence was their defensive walls. A mainstream historical fact is Sargon's policy of systematically dismantling the walls of conquered Sumerian cities. It was a practical move preventing rebellion, but also a profound psychological one. A city without walls was no longer a proud, self-contained kingdom. It was a dependent town in a larger state. As you march with Sargon's army, the campaign is a relentless slog through the dust and heat. The logistics are staggering. You need to feed and water thousands of soldiers in a hot, dry climate. This is where the Akkadian bureaucracy, which we'll see more of later, began to cut its teeth. Sargon appointed trusted Akkadian officials to govern the conquered cities, replacing the local Sumerian ensis. These governors, known as Sakanago, ensured that the grain and tribute flowed north to Sargon's coffers, not to the local temple. This was a radical change, diverting centuries of economic and religious tradition into the hands of a new foreign power. It was efficient, but it bred deep resentment. Amidst the grand strategy and brutal sieges, there are strange and human moments. A quirky detail from this period comes from archaeological finds of sling bullets. While the bow was the prestige weapon, the common soldier often used a simple sling. Archaeologists have found caches of clay and lead sling bullets from this era, and some of them are inscribed with messages. They bear the name of the king or general, like a modern bullet stamped with a manufacturer's mark. But some have more aggressive inscriptions, essentially taunts aimed at the enemy. They are the ancient world's equivalent of writing "This is for you" on a missile. It's a tiny, personal touch of psychological warfare amidst the chaos of battle. Sargon's conquests weren't limited to Sumer. After securing the south, he turned his attention elsewhere. He marched east, conquering parts of Elam in modern-day Iran. He turned west, following the Euphrates up into what is now Syria, possibly even reaching the Mediterranean as Lugal-Zagizi had only dreamed of. And he went north, into the highlands of Anatolia. The Sargon of his own inscriptions is an unstoppable force, a master of the world. But historians still argue about the true extent and nature of these more distant campaigns. Were they full-scale conquests resulting in permanent provinces, or were they more like massive, glorified raids designed to secure trade routes and bring back plunder and prestige? Whatever the reality, Sargon had, through ruthless military force and political genius, forged something entirely new under the sun. He had taken a patchwork of warring cities and hammered them into a single, cohesive unit. He had created the world's first empire. And every empire needs a capital. Having conquered everything from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean, Sargon needed a center for his new world order. He couldn't rule from Kish, the city of his usurped master. And he couldn't rule from Uruk or Uar, the heartlands of the Sumerians he had just subjugated. The resentment there would be too strong. He needed a new city, a capital built by him and for him, a statement in mud brick of his own power and the dawn of a new age. He needed Akkad. And so, somewhere on the banks of the Euphrates, he founded the city of Akkad or Akkad, which would lend its name to his entire empire and a language. You are now standing in this legendary city at the height of its power. The problem is, you're standing in a ghost, a phantom. Because despite being one of the most important cities of the ancient world for over a century, the capital of the First Empire, the city of Akkad has never been found. Its location is the single greatest archaeological mystery of ancient Mesopotamia. We know it existed. We have thousands of cuneiform tablets from other cities that talk about it, that mention sending tribute to it, that describe its kings and its catastrophic fall. But its ruins remain stubbornly, maddeningly lost, playing the longest and most successful game of hide-and-seek in history. So let's imagine it as the ancient texts describe it. It's a boomtown, rising from the plains with staggering speed. Unlike the chaotic, organic sprawl of Uruk, Akkad would have been planned, at least in its central administrative district. It is a hub of wealth, the place where all the tribute from the vast empire converges. You see caravans arriving daily, long lines of donkeys laden with cedar, wood from Lebanon, silver from the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia, lapis lazuli from the distant mines of Afghanistan, and carnelian from the Indus Valley. The docks on the Euphrates are a frenzy of activity, with boats unloading grain from the fertile fields of Sumer and textiles from workshops across the land. It's a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic city where you hear Akkadian spoken in the streets, but also Sumerian, Elamite, and the tongues of other conquered peoples. The architecture is monumental. Sargon and his successors built vast palaces and temples, not just to honor the gods, but to project their own power. The bricks are finer, the walls are thicker, the gates are grander than anything seen before. Later poems celebrating Akkad describe it in utopian terms, a city where the storehouses were provisioned to overflowing, where the elders were gifted with wisdom and the young with joy. Sargon, the great conqueror, was also remembered as a great builder, a king who made the city so prosperous that foreign peoples flocked to it willingly. A quirky and fascinating detail from these accounts describes how Sargon brought exotic plants and animals back from his campaigns. You can almost picture a royal garden in the center of the palace, a forerunner to the hanging gardens of Babylon, perhaps with a caged lion from the mountains of Syria, or strange trees that no one in Mesopotamia had ever seen before. It's a living trophy case, a symbol that Sargon's dominion wasn't just over people, but over nature itself. So, if it was so big and so important, where is it? This is the great open question. Historians still argue intensely over the lost city's location. The textual evidence suggests it was on or near the Euphrates, somewhere between the cities of Sippar and Kish. This places the search area in the crowded, heavily irrigated, and politically complicated region around modern-day Baghdad. Some scholars believe its ruins lie buried beneath the sprawling suburbs of the Iraqi capital itself, inaccessible. Others propose that it was built so close to the river that a catastrophic flood, or a gradual change in Euphrates' course over the millennia, either washed it away completely or left its remains stranded miles from any modern water source, hidden under sand dunes in the desert. The search is like looking for your car keys in a sandpit the size of a small country. Another compelling theory is that Akkad was never truly destroyed, but that its mud bricks were systematically cannibalized by later builders. In a land where stone is rare, a large, abandoned city is a free quarry. The bricks of Sargon's Great Palace might have been carted off to build a wall in Babylon or a canal in Sippar, scattering the city to the winds. The most mainstream historical fact here is a frustrating one. Every promising mound, every tell, in the suspected zone that has been excavated has turned out to be something else. The city of Akkad remains a blank spot on the map. This phantom quality makes our journey here all the more surreal. You are walking through streets of memory, through buildings described on clay tablets that were found hundreds of miles away. You're in a city built of words. But its impact was undeniably real. Akkad was the central gear in a new imperial machine. It was from here that Sargon and his administrators had to solve the puzzle of how to govern a vast, diverse, and deeply resentful territory. Tearing down walls and collecting tribute was the easy part. Holding it all together required something more. It required a new ideology, a new way of binding the empire's disparate parts to the center. And for this, Sargon would turn to his own family, appointing them to the most powerful positions in the land. He would make his sons his generals and successors. And in a stroke of political genius, he would make his daughter the most powerful woman in the world. Sargon understood that military might alone could not hold his new empire together indefinitely. The Sumerian South, with its ancient cities and powerful local traditions, remained a hotbed of potential rebellion. He needed to win not just the war, but the peace. He needed to control not just their bodies and their grain, but their hearts and minds. His solution was a brilliant act of cultural and religious politics. He would take control of the most important religious institution in Sumer, and he would install his own daughter at its head. We travel south from the ghost city of Akkad to the ancient city of Ur. Ur was the cult center of the powerful Sumerian moon god, Nana or Sin in Akkadian. The high priestess of Nana at Ur was a position of immense prestige and influence, often held by the daughters of kings. Sargon saw his opportunity. He appointed his own daughter to this role, a woman we know by the name she took for her office, Enheduanna. And with this act, history pivots. Because Enheduanna was not just a political appointee. She was a poet, a theologian, and a genius. And she is the first author in all of human history whose name we know. Imagine this scene. Enheduanna arrives in Ur, an Akkadian princess in the heart of a conquered Sumerian city. She is an outsider, a symbol of the new northern power. Her very presence is a daily reminder to the people of Ur of who is now in charge. Her official duties are complex. She oversees the temple's vast economic holdings, its lands, its workshops, its livestock. She presides over the elaborate rituals and festivals dedicated to the moon god. She is the human wife of the god Nana, a sacred marriage that ensured the fertility and prosperity of the land. It's a job that is part CEO, part archbishop, and part first lady. But Enheduanna did something more. She picked up a stylus and began to write. Not just administrative records or accounts, but powerful, personal, sublime poetry. This is the mainstream historical fact that makes her so extraordinary. Over 4,000 years before Shakespeare or Homer, a woman was composing literary works of the highest order and signing her name to them. Her most famous works are a series of 42 hymns dedicated to the temples of Sumer and Akkad, known as the Sumerian Temple Hymns. In this collection, she systematically travels, in verse, from city to city, from temple to temple, describing the unique character and attributes of each one and its patron god. It was a masterful political project disguised as a religious one. By weaving the Akkadian and Sumerian gods together into a single, cohesive literary tapestry, she was creating a shared religious identity for the new empire. She was using poetry to stitch the two cultures together. You can picture her in her quarters within the temple complex, the Jaipar, dictating her verses to a scribe, the rhythmic scratching of reed on clay the only sound. Her poetry is not dry or formulaic. It is vivid, passionate, and often deeply personal. Her most powerful work is a poem called The Exaltation of Inanna. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, the patron of Uruk, was a Sumerian deity, but she was also adopted by the Akkadians as Ishtar. She was the perfect bridge between the two cultures, and Enheduanna latched onto her. In the poem, Enheduanna describes a political rebellion in Ur that drove her from her office and into exile. She writes with raw, visceral emotion about her despair and humiliation. He has made me walk in the briars of the mountain. / he has stripped me of the rightful crown of the high priesthood. / he has given me a knife and a dagger, saying to me, these are appropriate for you. It is a cry of anguish across the millennia. But then she turns to her goddess, Inanna, not just as a distant deity, but as her personal champion. She calls on Inanna to restore her to her rightful place, to smite her enemies. The poem is a declaration of faith, but also a political manifesto. It identifies her personal authority with the divine power of the goddess, a goddess who bridges the Sumerian and Akkadian worlds. It's a work of incredible theological and political sophistication. And it worked. The historical records suggest she was, in fact, restored to her position in UR. A quirky detail about Enheduanna's legacy is the Disk of Enheduanna, a small alabaster disc found in UR. It depicts her in a ritual procession, and an inscription on the back clearly identifies her by name. Enheduanna, Zera priestess, wife of the god Nana, daughter of Sargon, king of the world. It is the first time in history that a work of art and a text have come together to give us both the name and the image of a specific author. We can look at this carved face from 4,300 years ago and say with certainty, this is her. This is the woman who first said, I wrote this. The debate among scholars is no longer about whether she was a real person. The evidence is conclusive. Instead, historians still argue about the extent of her authorship. Was she the sole creative genius behind these complex poems, or did she lead a workshop of temple poets and scribes, acting more as an editor-in-chief and lending her prestigious name to their collective work? Either way, her influence was profound. She set a precedent, and for the next 500 years, it became tradition for the kings of Mesopotamia to appoint their daughters as the high priestess of UR. She created a powerful role for royal women that would endure for centuries. She was Sargon's daughter, yes, but in the long run, her legacy, the very idea of authorship, might be even more enduring than his empire. While Enheduanna was weaving the empire together with poetry and theology, her father Sargon and his administrators were binding it with something far less glamorous but equally essential: bureaucracy. An empire this large, this diverse, could not be run on charisma and military force alone. It needed a system. It needed paperwork. And the Akkadians, using the simple tools of the Sumerians before them, elevated bureaucracy to an art form. You are now inside a government archive, perhaps in the lost capital of Akkad, or maybe in a regional governor's office in a conquered Sumerian city like Umma. The room is dry, dusty, and lined with wooden shelves. And on those shelves, neatly stacked, are thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. This is the empire's hard drive, its central nervous system, and it runs on mud. The air hums with a quiet, intense activity. Scribes, the indispensable civil servants of the empire, sit cross-legged on the floor, their fingers flying as they press wedge-shaped marks into damp clay. One is recording tax receipts: 20 sheep from the village of Gursu, 10 jars of high-quality beer from a temple brewery, 100 bushels of barley from the field south of Nippur. Each transaction is recorded, witnessed, and signed with the rolling of a cylinder seal. This is the nuts and bolts of imperial control. By centralizing the collection of taxes and tribute, Sargon and his successors did more than just enrich their capital. They broke the economic power of the old Sumerian temples. Before Akkad, the temple was the local economic engine, controlling land and labor. Now, a significant portion of that wealth was being systematically siphoned off to the state, to a secular authority embodied by the king. This was a revolutionary shift in the structure of society. The Akkadians didn't just collect taxes, they standardized everything. A mainstream historical fact is the Akkadian introduction of standardized weights and measures across the entire empire. A gur of barley in Akkad was now the same as a gur of barley in UR. A mina of silver was a consistent unit of weight from the Persian Gulf to the Syrian plains. This wasn't just for accounting, it greased the wheels of commerce. A merchant could now draw up a contract in one city and have it be perfectly understood and legally binding in another, hundreds of miles away. It was the ancient world's equivalent of creating the Eurozone, fostering a massive empire-wide common market. But how do you get all this information, all these orders and reports, from one end of the empire to the other? There are no phones, no internet, no postal service. The Akkadians developed a sophisticated messenger system. Relays of runners and chariot riders could carry clay tablets, often encased in protective clay envelopes, across the vast distances with surprising speed. Way stations were set up along major routes to provide fresh mounts and provisions. A king in Akkad could send an order to his governor in Syria and, with a bit of luck, receive a report back within a matter of weeks. It was a staggering logistical achievement, and it was all powered by human and animal muscle. One quirky and rather brilliant innovation was the use of those clay envelopes. A scribe would write a confidential message on a tablet. Before the clay dried, he would sprinkle it with a fine layer of dry clay powder, like dusting a cake with flour. Then he would wrap a fresh layer of wet clay around the whole thing, forming an envelope, and write the address on the outside. The powder layer prevented the envelope from sticking to the letter inside. The only way for the recipient to read the message was to smash the outer envelope. This made the system tamper-evident. If the envelope arrived broken, you knew someone had read your mail. It was a simple but effective piece of information security for 1,000 years before digital encryption. The level of detail in their record-keeping is astounding. Archaeologists have found tablets that are meticulous records of land sales, detailing the exact dimensions of a field, its location relative to canals and neighbors, the sale price, and a long list of witnesses. They have found labor contracts, marriage agreements, and court records detailing legal disputes. In one case, we have records of a court case involving a corrupt official accused of embezzling silver. The tablets record the testimony, the verdict, and the punishment. This wasn't a lawless military state. It was a highly organized, legalistic society that ran on rules and records. Historians still argue about the degree to which the Akkadian kings imposed a uniform legal code on the entire empire. While we have no single code of Sargon like the later code of Hammurabi, the consistency of legal documents across the empire suggests a powerful, centralized legal framework was being put in place. This bureaucratic machine was Sargon's greatest, most enduring invention, even more so than the empire itself. He proved that you could rule a vast, multi-ethnic territory not just by force, but by standardizing, recording, and controlling its economic life. But this vast system had a vulnerability. It all depended on the man at the top. Sargon ruled for an astonishing 56 years, a reign of legendary length. He built the system, perfected it, and became a figure of myth even in his own lifetime. But what would happen when the legend was gone? The entire vast, meticulously documented clay tablet enterprise was about to be put to the test. When the great Sargon finally died of old age, a palpable shudder must have run through the empire. The man who had built the world was gone. The conquered cities of Sumer, which had been resentfully paying taxes and nursing their grudges for decades, saw their chance. The moment the news of Sargon's death reached the south, the rebellions began. The massive bureaucracy and the powerful army were now in the hands of Sargon's son, Ramesh. And he had a very, very big problem. You are now in the shoes of Ramesh, the new king. Your father was a legend, a figure who single-handedly created this empire. You, on the other hand, are just his son. You have to prove yourself, and you have to do it quickly. The challenge is immense. A massive coalition of Sumerian cities, led by Uar and Umma, rises up in what historians call the Great Revolt. They are not just refusing to pay taxes. They are actively trying to dismantle your father's creation and return to the old ways of independent city-states. Ramesh's reign was, in essence, one long, brutal war to reconquer his own empire. He inherited the throne, but he had to earn the empire. He marches his army south, just as his father had done, but this time he's not fighting a collection of rival kings. He's fighting a full-blown national uprising. His inscriptions are grim and bloody. He records massive battles, speaks of slaughtering thousands of enemy soldiers and taking thousands more as prisoners, who were then likely put to work as state-controlled labor, perhaps building fortifications in the capital. He fights his way down to the Persian Gulf, crushing the rebellion with overwhelming force. It's a messy, brutal, and costly affair, but he succeeds. He holds the empire together by the skin of his teeth. After securing Sumer, he has to deal with rebellions in the east in Elam. Again, he marches his army, puts down the revolt, and brings back enormous amounts of plunder to Akkad. His reign of 9 years seems to have been spent perpetually stamping out fires on the frontiers. He was a capable general, no doubt, but his rule was purely reactionary, a desperate struggle to maintain the status quo his father had established. But the story gets darker. A quirky and morbid tidbit about Rimish is how he died. According to later chronicles, he wasn't killed in battle or by a foreign assassin. He was murdered by his own courtiers in his own palace. And the murder weapon was not a dagger or poison. The chronicles say they killed him with their cylinder seals. Remember those small, hard stone cylinders used to sign documents? The story suggests his officials ganged up on him and bludgeoned him to death with their seals. It's a bizarre, almost comical image, but it speaks volumes. It's the bureaucracy itself rising up to kill the king. Historians still argue about the truth of this account. It could be a later fabrication to delegitimize his line, but it hints at deep instability and dissatisfaction right at the very heart of the Akkadian court. Was he a tyrant? Was he just unpopular? We'll never know for sure. Upon Ramesh's death, the throne passes to his brother Manish-Tushu. If you're Manish-Tushu, you're probably feeling a little nervous at your coronation, maybe eyeing your minister's seals a bit suspiciously. Manish-Tushu seems to have learned a lesson from his brother's bloody reign. While he also engaged in military campaigns, his inscriptions focus more on trade and economic development. His most famous artifact is the Manish-Tushu obelisk, tall four-sided monument of black diorite stone, now in the Louvre. It is not a record of war. It is a massive, incredibly detailed legal document, a deed recording his purchase of huge tracts of land in central Mesopotamia. This obelisk is a fascinating window into the Akkadian economy. It lists, with painstaking precision, the dimensions of the fields, the names of the sellers, some 49 of them, and the incredibly complex payment. The land was bought not just with silver, but with a whole range of goods: textiles, copper vessels, oil, and even beer. The document also lists the gifts given to the seller's relatives, essentially a way to get the whole family to sign off on the deal and prevent future disputes. It's a mainstream historical fact that this obelisk represents one of the largest land transactions ever recorded from the ancient world. Manish-Tushu was consolidating the crown's direct control over the most valuable resource, agricultural land. He was using the empire's wealth to buy up the heartland, creating vast royal estates. It was a more subtle, economic form of control than his brother's brute force. Manish-Tushu also sponsored major trade expeditions. It claims to have sent a fleet of ships from the Persian Gulf all the way to two mysterious locations named Magan and Meloha. Magan is now believed to be modern Oman, a source of copper and diorite, the very stone his obelisk is made from. Meloha is widely identified with the Indus Valley civilization in modern-day Pakistan and India. The Akkadians were trading with a civilization over 1,000 miles away, a testament to their incredible reach and maritime capabilities. But despite his apparent success, Manish-Tushu's reign of 15 years also ended in violence. Like his brother before him, he was killed in a palace conspiracy. The first two successors of the great Sargon, his own brawling sons, both met violent ends at the hands of their own people. The empire was holding together, but the center was rotting. The house of Sargon was tearing itself apart. The stage was set for a new kind of king to take the throne, a man who would learn from the struggles of his uncles and take the concept of kingship to a terrifying new level. He was Manish-Tushu's son, Sargon's grandson, and his name was Naram-Sin. The empire that Naram-Sin inherited from his murdered father, Manish-Tushu, was outwardly strong but internally fragile. 2 kings in a row had been assassinated. The Sumerian south was pacified but resentful. The bureaucracy was powerful, but as the cylinder seal incident showed, potentially treasonous. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, seemed to understand that the old model wasn't working. Brute force, like his uncle Rimish used, only bred more rebellion. Economic consolidation, like his father practiced, was too slow and didn't inspire the kind of loyalty needed to hold a fractious empire together. He needed a new source of authority, an ideology so powerful it would place him beyond the reach of mere mortals. At the beginning of his reign, he faced the same challenge his uncles had, another great revolt. But this one was even bigger. It wasn't just the Sumerian cities. The rebellion was widespread, involving cities in the north and in Syria. It was a massive, coordinated effort to throw off Akkadian rule once and for all. Naram-Sin met this challenge with incredible energy and military genius. He didn't just shuttle from one crisis to another. He seemed to be everywhere at once, leading his armies personally, crushing the rebel coalitions in a series of lightning campaigns. His inscriptions boast that he was victorious in 9 battles in a single year, a whirlwind of conquest that re-established Akkadian dominance with shocking finality. But victory in battle wasn't enough. Naram-Sin needed to transform the very nature of his kingship. And he did so with one of the boldest, most audacious acts of self-promotion in human history. He declared himself a god. This was a radical departure from Mesopotamian tradition. Previous kings were seen as shepherds of the people, agents, or chosen servants of the gods. They were powerful, yes, but they were human. Naram-Sin was the first Mesopotamian king to claim divinity for himself while he was still alive. He had a divine determinative, the wedge-shaped sign for God, written before his name on inscriptions. He was no longer Naram-Sin. He was the god Naram-Sin. He gave himself a new title, King of the 4 quarters of the world, a claim to universal dominion. His official portraits changed too. Where Sargon was depicted as a man, a king, Naram-Sin had himself sculpted wearing a horned helmet, an attribute that had previously been reserved exclusively for deities. The most spectacular monument to this new ideology is the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, another masterpiece now in the Louvre. It commemorates victory over the Lalubi, a tribal people from the Zagros Mountains to the east. But its message is far more than just a battle report. The stele is a stunning piece of art. Instead of the rigid, horizontal registers of older art like the stele of the vultures, this is a single, dynamic, diagonal scene. You see Naram-Sin, tall and perfectly proportioned, climbing a mountain. His own soldiers look up at him in adoration. His defeated enemies are trampled under his feet, one with a spear through his neck, another begging for mercy. And Naram-Sin himself is not looking at his soldiers or his enemies. He is gazing upwards, towards 2 stars that represent the gods, but he is almost on their level. He is fit, powerful, and wears the horned helmet of divinity. The message is unambiguous. He is a god in human form, a victorious warrior king who is the sole master of the earthly realm. This stele is a mainstream historical fact and one of the absolute pinnacles of ancient Near Eastern art. This self-deification was a calculated political move. If the king is a god, then rebellion against him is not just treason, it is sacrilege. Disobeying an order is an act of heresy. It elevates the king above the petty squabbles of the palace and the resentments of conquered cities. His authority no longer comes from his lineage or his military prowess alone, but from his very nature. It's a brilliant, if megalomaniacal, solution to the problem of imperial instability. And for a time, it worked. Naram-Sin's reign of 37 years is considered the absolute peak of the Akkadian Empire. He expanded its borders, built magnificent temples, and presided over a period of unprecedented power and stability. The empire was secure, the trade routes were open, and the god king seemed invincible. A quirky tidbit from his reign comes from legal documents. After he deified himself, the oath taken in legal contracts changed. People no longer swore by the life of the various gods of the pantheon alone. They swore by the life of the god Naram-Sin. His divine status became a part of the everyday legal fabric of the empire. Imagine going to court and having to swear an oath on the life of your prime minister or president. It's a sign of how deeply his new ideology penetrated society. However, this unprecedented act of hubris had a dark side. Later Mesopotamian tradition would look back on Naram-Sin with a mixture of awe and fear. They saw his power, But they also saw his pride as a terrible transgression that would ultimately bring ruin not just upon himself, but upon his entire dynasty. While contemporary sources from his reign are glowing, the stories written about him centuries later cast him as a tragic hero whose arrogance angered the gods and set the stage for a divine punishment of epic proportions. Historians still argue whether this later negative portrayal reflects a genuine memory of his tyrannical nature, or if it was simply a convenient way for later generations to explain the inexplicable, the sudden and catastrophic collapse of this seemingly invincible god-led empire. Naram-Sin had climbed his mountain and touched the stars. But in Mesopotamian cosmology, what goes up must eventually come down. And the fall was going to be a long one. The empire under the god-king Naram-Sin was at its zenith. The storehouses of Akkad were full, the armies were victorious, and the king himself was a living deity. From the outside, it looked eternal, indestructible. But in the minds of later Mesopotamians, looking back from a world of ruin, this glittering peak was the very cause of the disaster. To explain the shocking collapse that followed, they didn't write a historical analysis of economic trends or political instability. They told a story. They wrote a great literary epic known as The Curse of Akkad. This poem is our guide to the fall. It's not a factual news report, but something more powerful, a morality tale, a myth that seeks to find meaning in a national trauma. It lays the blame for the destruction of the world's first empire squarely at the feet of one man, Naram-Sin. The story begins in the golden age of Akkad under Sargon, a time of prosperity and divine favor. But when Naram-Sin takes the throne, things begin to change. The poem tells us that for some reason, the great god of the Sumerian pantheon, Enlil, the Lord of the Wind, whose main temple was in the holy city of Nippur, turns his back on Akkad. The divine favor that had blessed the city is withdrawn. Business slows down. The city's bright destiny becomes clouded. Naram-Sin, the proud god-king, is troubled by this. He performs liver divination, remember that quirky practice from Libelzajizi's time, but the sheep's liver gives no answer. For 7 years, he waits for a favorable sign from Enlil, a sign that never comes. His patience, never his strong suit, runs out. And here, he commits his great transgression, the act of supreme hubris that will doom his people. He decides that if the god will not answer him, he will force the issue. He musters his army, not to fight a foreign enemy, but to attack a god. He marches on Nippur, on Enlil's sacred precinct, the Ikkad Temple, which was considered the holiest place on earth, the mooring rope of heaven and earth. The poem describes the sacrilege in horrified detail. Naram-Sin's soldiers smash down the gates with axes. They tear treasure from the walls and load it onto ships to be carried back to Akkad. Naram-Sin, in his arrogance, set his ships at the dock of the house that is not a house, desecrating the sacred space. He has, in essence, declared war on the king of the gods. And the king of the gods responds with fury. Enlil, enraged by the destruction of his holy city, unleashes a terrible vengeance. But he doesn't just strike down Naram-Sin directly. He unleashes a new people upon the land, a people no one has ever seen before. The poem describes them in terrifying, almost subhuman terms. Enlil brought out of the mountains those who do not resemble other people, who are not reckoned as part of the land. They are the Gutians. The poem says they have the intelligence of a dog, the features of a monkey. They descend from the Zagros mountains like a plague of locusts, covering the earth like a storm. They disrupt the canals, turn fertile fields back into wastelands, and plunge the civilized lands of Sumer and Akkad into chaos and famine. This is the mainstream historical fact that the poem is built around, the historical invasion of Mesopotamian lands by a people from the mountains known as the Gutians. But in the poem, they are not just a rival power. They are a divine weapon, a force of nature unleashed by an angry god. The curse takes effect. The thriving trade of the empire collapses. The courier could not travel his road. The poem laments. The canals grow silted. The fields dry up. Starvation grips the cities. The price of grain skyrockets. People become so desperate that the poem chillingly describes parents barricading their doors against their own starving children. The great city of Akkad itself is utterly destroyed, never to be inhabited again. Akkad, instead of your sweet-tasting water, may bitter water flow. For the crime of the desecration of Iker, may great things be overturned. The story is a powerful piece of propaganda, likely written by Sumerian priests in the period after the Akkadian Empire fell. It reasserts the power of the traditional Sumerian gods, especially Enlil of Nippur, over the upstart, self-deified Akkadian kings. It's a cautionary tale. This is what happens when a human king, no matter how powerful, forgets his place. It's a way of making sense of a senseless catastrophe. The empire didn't fall because of economic decline or administrative overreach. It fell because one man's pride offended heaven. A fascinating quirky detail is the gods' reaction to Enlil's destructive rage. The other major gods, including Inanna/Ishtar, who had been a patron of Akkad, are horrified by the totality of the destruction. They collectively pronounce their own curse upon the city of Akkad, that it should be destroyed and never rebuilt, so that the great god Enlil might be pacified and not unleash such a devastating force upon the entire world ever again. This part of the poem provides a mythical explanation for a real-world archaeological mystery. Why was the great capital of Akkad abandoned, and its location lost to time? The answer, according to the poets, was a divine decree. Historians still argue, of course, about the historical reality behind the myth. Did Naram-Sin actually attack the temple at Nippur? The archaeological evidence is ambiguous at best. There are no contemporary records of him doing so. In fact, he claimed to be a great builder of temples, including the one at Nippur. So was the curse of Akkad a complete fabrication, a piece of political fiction? Or does it preserve the memory of a real, shocking event that Naram-Sin's own scribes would have been terrified to record? The poem is a ghost story told by a civilization about its own demise, a story that would haunt the Mesopotamian imagination for the next 2,000 years. The Curse of Akkad gives us a powerful, mythic explanation for the empire's fall, a sacrilegious king, and the wrath of a god. It points the finger at a terrifying new enemy, the Gutians, as the instrument of that wrath. But who are these people really? We leave the world of epic poetry and try to piece together the historical reality of the invaders who are so often blamed for bringing the Akkadian Empire to its knees. You are now in the Zagros Mountains, the rugged, formidable mountain range that forms the eastern border of Mesopotamia, in what is today western Iran. This is a world away from the flat, irrigated plains. It's a land of high valleys, steep ridges, and hardy, tribal peoples. For centuries, the settled, civilized people of the plains have had a tense relationship with these highlanders. They were a source of trade goods, like timber and stone, but they were also a constant source of raids and insecurity. To the sophisticated urbanites of Akkad and Sumer, the mountain people were barbarians. And the most feared of all were the Gutians. Our knowledge of the Gutians is frustratingly slim. They left no cities, no literature, no monuments of their own. Almost everything we know about them was written by their enemies, the Mesopotamians, who, to put it mildly, were not fans. Remember the description from the poem, people with the intelligence of a dog and the face of a monkey. It's pure xenophobic propaganda, painting them as less than human. The name Gutium was used by Mesopotamian scribes as a sort of catch-all term for the various tribes of the central Zagros, and it became synonymous with barbarism and destruction. For most of the Akkadian Empire's history, the Gutians were a manageable threat. Sargon and his successors launched campaigns into the mountains to keep them in check, treating them as a nuisance to be swatted down periodically. But towards the end of Naram-Sin's reign and into the reign of his son, Shar-Kali-Sheri, king of all kings, something changed. The Gutian raids became more frequent, more organized, and more daring. They were no longer just hitting outlying villages. They were beginning to threaten the heartland. Imagine being a farmer on the eastern edge of the empire. For generations, your biggest worries have been the river flooding at the wrong time or a drought shriveling your barley. Now you have a new fear, a shadow from the mountains. A lookout cries out, and you see them descending from the foothills, small, fast-moving bands of warriors, not weighed down by heavy armor or organized in neat phalanxes. They sweep through the fields, seize the harvest, drive off the livestock, and vanish back into the hills before the slow-moving imperial army can respond. This is guerrilla warfare, and the highly centralized, bureaucratic Akkadian state was ill-equipped to handle it. The mainstream historical fact is that Gutian incursions played a significant role in destabilizing the final decades of the Akkadian Empire. The Sumerian king list, a chronological record of kingship, records a period of chaos after the death of Shar-Kali-Sheri, laconically stating who was king, who was not king, before listing a series of Gutian rulers. This indicates that their influence grew to the point where they could actually take control, at least nominally, over parts of the former empire. For about a century, a line of Gutian kings ruled over a fractured Mesopotamia. However, the traditional view of the Gutians as a mindless horde of savages who single-handedly destroyed a great civilization is now being seriously questioned by historians. The Curse of Akkad is a powerful story, but it's not history. The collapse was likely a much more complex process. The Gutians were probably not the cause of the collapse, but rather a symptom of it. As the central authority of the Akkadian kings began to weaken due to internal strife, remember all those assassinations and other pressures, the empire's ability to defend its long, porous border diminished. The Gutians simply took advantage of a pre-existing power vacuum. They were opportunists, not a world-destroying juggernaut. This leads to the great scholarly debate. Were the Gutians wreckers or just inheritors? Did they actively destroy the Akkadian infrastructure of canals and cities, as the curse suggests? Or did they simply move into a region that was already falling apart, unable or uninterested in maintaining the complex systems of their predecessors? The archaeological evidence doesn't show a clear, widespread layer of destruction that can be attributed solely to them. It looks more like a gradual decay. A quirky and revealing tidbit is what we know of the Gutian kings themselves. Though their people were non-literate, the few who managed to establish themselves as rulers in Mesopotamia tried to act the part. We have a handful of inscriptions from one Gutian king, Eridupazur. He doesn't style himself as a mountain barbarian. He adopts the traditional titles of a Mesopotamian monarch, calling himself King of Gutium, King of the Four Quarters, the very title invented by the divine Naram-Sin. It's a bit like a pirate captain capturing a naval vessel and immediately putting on the admiral's fancy hat. He was trying to use the prestige and the administrative language of the very civilization his people were helping to dismantle. It shows that the Gutians were not immune to the cultural power of Mesopotamia. They were, in their own way, assimilated by it, even as they ruled it. The Gutian period is often called a Dark Age, but that might be an overstatement. Life went on. In the south, some of the old Sumerian cities, like Lagash and Uar, seem to have enjoyed a degree of independence and even prosperity under the loose and inefficient Gutian overlordship. The Gutians were a disruptive force, no doubt. They hastened the end of the centralized Akkadian state, but they were just one piece of a much larger, more frightening puzzle of collapse. Another, perhaps even more powerful shadow was looming, one that came not from the mountains, but from the sky itself. While the Gutian invaders and the mythic curse of Akkad provide compelling narratives for the fall of Akkad, many scientists and historians now point to a more insidious, invisible culprit. A silent killer that respects no borders and cannot be fought with spears or placated with prayers. That culprit is climate change. We are shifting our perspective now from the political to the environmental, to see how a subtle change of the weather may have brought a mighty empire to its knees. You are standing in the dusty ruins of a city in northern Mesopotamia, near the Khabur River Valley in modern Syria. This was once a thriving agricultural region, the breadbasket for the northern half of the Akkadian Empire. Under Sargon and Naram-Sin, this area was heavily populated, dotted with towns and villages, its fields crisscrossed with irrigation canals. Now, as you stand here around the year 2200 BCE, the scene is one of desolation. The canals are choked with dust. The fields are cracked and barren. The once bustling towns are silent, their mud brick walls slowly crumbling back into the earth from which they were made. The people are gone. Archaeological surveys of this region show a catastrophic pattern of widespread settlement abandonment at precisely this time. We're talking about a population collapse, a mass exodus. People simply walked away from their homes and their fields because the land could no longer support them. They became climate refugees 4,200 years ago. What happened? The evidence, gathered from sources as diverse as Greenland ice cores, sediment layers from the Gulf of Oman, and mineral deposits in caves, all points to the same thing. A mainstream historical fact, now widely accepted, is the 4.2 kilo-year event. This was a sudden, intense, and prolonged period of aridification, a megadrought, that affected a vast swath of the planet, from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. For the Akkadian Empire, it was a body blow. Imagine the effects. The northern parts of the empire, which relied on rainfall for their agriculture, were hit first and hardest. The spring rains failed, not just for 1 year, but for year after year, decade after decade. The grain harvests withered. The great herds of sheep and goats that formed the region's wealth died off from lack of pasture. The people, facing starvation, began to move. They flowed south, down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, seeking food and water in the irrigated heartland of Sumer. But the south had its own problems. The great rivers, the lifeblood of the empire, were fed by rainfall and snowmelt in the mountains of Anatolia to the north. With the drought affecting those source regions, the volume of the rivers themselves would have decreased dramatically. Less water in the rivers meant less water available for the vast irrigation networks. The Sumerian cities, already struggling to support their own populations, were suddenly faced with a massive influx of desperate, hungry people from the north, competing for ever-dwindling resources. The social and political strain must have been immense. It's the perfect recipe for societal collapse, environmental stress leading to resource scarcity, leading to mass migration, leading to conflict, and the breakdown of central authority. This climate-driven collapse theory provides a powerful context for the other factors we've seen. The Akkadian invasions. Much easier for mountain tribes to raid and disrupt a settled population that is already weakened by famine and internal strife. The Curse of Akkad. It's easy to see how a generation experiencing inexplicable, relentless drought and famine would interpret it as a punishment from the gods. The myth of the curse could be a cultural memory of this very real environmental catastrophe, translated into the theological language of the time. A quirky and rather poignant piece of evidence comes from the soil itself. Archaeologists examining soil layers from this period in northern Mesopotamia have found a massive increase in wind-blown dust and sand particles. They can literally see the moment the topsoil blew away, when the green fields turned to desert. It's the ghost of a dust bowl, written in the earth. You can almost feel the grit in your teeth, the constant wind, the sun beating down from a hazy, dust-filled sky. Of course, the exact interplay of these factors is still a matter of intense scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the relative importance of each element. Was it the climate that broke the empire, with the Akkadians just picking at the corpse? Or was the empire already so politically fragile that it would have fallen apart anyway, with the drought just being the final push? It's the ultimate historical chicken and egg problem. There is no single, simple answer. The fall of Akkad was likely a perfect storm, a dreadful synergy of political decay, foreign invasion, and catastrophic climate change, all hitting at the same time. You watch as one of the last families finally gives up. They pack what little they can carry, a few pots, a bag of precious, saved grain, and join the stream of people shuffling south along the dried-up riverbed. They are walking away from generations of history, from their homes, their fields, their entire world. The great Akkadian Empire, the empire of the god King Naram-Sin, the king of the four quarters, wasn't just conquered. In many places, it simply blew away on the wind. The world of dust and ruin prophesied in the Curse of Akkad had become a terrifying reality. Out of the dust and chaos of the fallen Akkadian Empire and the subsequent century of loose, disruptive Akkadian rule, you might expect a long, dark age of decline. And for many parts of Mesopotamia, that was true. But in the old Sumerian heartland in the south, something remarkable began to happen. The collapse of the centralized Akkadian state, which had siphoned all wealth and power to its northern capital, had an unintended side effect. It allowed the old resilient city-states of Sumer to re-emerge, to reclaim their identities, and to flourish once more. This was not a return to the past, but a renaissance. The city of Lagash, one of the old rivals from the pre-Sargonic era, was one of the first to rise from the ashes. While the Akkadian kings held nominal power over the region, they seemed to have ruled with a light touch, more interested in collecting tribute than in micromanaging city affairs. This left a power vacuum that ambitious local governors, or insis, were eager to fill. One of these was a man named Uarbau, who established a powerful local dynasty at Lagash. He and his successors began to restore the temples, redig the canals, and bring a semblance of order and prosperity back to their corner of the world. You are now in the city of Girsu, the sacred capital of the state of Lagash. The air here feels different from the desperate, dusty landscape of the north. There is a sense of renewal, of purpose. You see construction everywhere. Workers are hauling new bricks to repair the temple of their city god, named Girsu, the same god whose victory was celebrated on the steel of the vultures so long ago. The fields around the city are green again, the canals flowing with water. The scribal schools are busy, but they are not writing in Akkadian, the language of the fallen conquerors. They are writing in Sumerian. This period marks a conscious and deliberate revival of Sumerian language, literature, and art. It was a cultural statement, a way of saying, we are still here. Our traditions have survived. This revival is what historians call the Sumerian Renaissance, or the Neo-Sumerian period. It was a rejection of the Akkadian model of a centralized, multi-ethnic empire ruled by a divine king. The new rulers of Lagash didn't call themselves gods or kings of the four quarters. They used the old, humble Sumerian title of Insi or governor, portraying themselves as pious servants of their city's patron deity. Their official art reflects this. Gone are the dynamic, militaristic, personality-driven victory steels of a Naramsin. Instead, the art is formal, serene, and pious. The statues show rulers with their hands clasped in prayer, forever worshiping the gods on behalf of their people. A mainstream historical fact of this era is the incredible literary output. It was during this period of cultural rebirth that many of the most famous works of Sumerian literature, including parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Curse of Akkad itself, were written down in their most complete forms. The scribes of the Sumerian Renaissance saw themselves as curators of their ancient heritage. They collected the old stories, hymns, and proverbs, editing them and compiling them into literary canons. It was a monumental effort to preserve their culture after a long period of foreign domination. Without their work, our knowledge of Sumerian civilization would be a tiny fraction of what it is today. But the Akkadian presence, however loose, was still an insult to Sumerian pride. They were foreign rulers, barbarians from the mountains, occupying the sacred land of Sumer. The desire for true independence was growing. The spark for the final liberation came not from Lagash, but from the old city of Uruk, the first city, the former capital of Lugalzagizi. A man named Utu-Hengel, the governor of Uruk, decided the time had come. He rallied an army and marched out to confront the Akkadian king, Tirakan. The story of the battle, as told in Utu-Hengel's inscriptions, is dramatic. Tirakan, the Akkadian king, sent messengers ahead, but Utu-Hengel captured them. He then met the Akkadian army on the field and won a decisive victory. Tirakan fled back to a town and tried to hide, but he was recognized and handed over to Utu-Hengel by the town's own citizens, who were clearly tired of their Akkadian masters. Utu-Hengel placed his foot on Tirakan's neck in a classic gesture of triumph and declared that he had restored the kingship of Sumer. He had broken the Akkadian yoke once and for all. A quirky detail that humanizes this grand historical moment is found in the description of Tirakan's capture. The inscription notes that when Tirakan fled, his wife and child were not with him. He had sent them ahead to a place of safety, but he himself was captured before he could rejoin them. It's a small, sad detail that reminds you these were real people caught in the sweep of history, not just names on a king list. Utu-Hingal's victory was a turning point. He had liberated Sumer, but his reign as the new king of Sumer was destined to be short. The historical accounts are sparse, but they suggest he died in a bizarre accident, possibly drowning while overseeing the construction of a weir or dam on a canal. Leadership of the newly freed Sumer fell to another man, Utu-Hingal's governor in the great city of Ur, a man who would take the Sumerian Renaissance to its absolute peak and build the last and greatest native Sumerian empire. But before we meet him, we must spend a moment with the greatest king of the Lagash dynasty, a ruler who represents the heart and soul of this peaceful, pious revival. In the midst of the Sumerian cultural rebirth, while the Akkadians still held a loose grip on the land and before the final liberation by Utu-Hingal, the city-state of Lagash reached its zenith under the rule of a man who was the polar opposite of an Akkadian conqueror. His name was Gudea. He was the son-in-law of the previous ruler, Ur-Bao, and he represents the absolute ideal of the pious, peaceful Sumerian king. You are walking through the streets of his capital, Girsu. The city is clean, orderly, and prosperous. The sounds are not of marching armies, but of construction. Gudea was, above all else, a builder. His reign is not remembered for wars or conquests. In fact, his inscriptions barely mention any military activity at all. Instead, they are filled with obsessive, loving detail about his primary life's work. The restoration and rebuilding of the temples of his gods, especially the Aninu, the great temple of his city's patron god, Ningirsu. Gudea's inscriptions, recorded on a series of large clay cylinders, are some of the longest and most complete literary texts we have from Sumer. They don't just say, "I built a temple." They tell the whole story, from the divine inspiration to the final celebration. The story begins with Gudea receiving a vision in a dream. The god Ningirsu appears to him and gives him the detailed blueprint for the new temple, a divine architectural plan. But Gudea, the humble servant, doesn't fully understand the dream. So he consults with the goddess Nanshi, a divine dream interpreter, who explains the meaning of every symbol. It's a beautiful expression of the ideal relationship between a king and his gods. The gods command, the king obeys. The preparation for this sacred task was immense. Gudea claims to have sent trade expeditions to the farthest corners of the known world to gather the finest materials. This is a mainstream historical fact that gives us a priceless map of ancient trade routes. He brought cedarwood from the Amanus Mountains in Syria, diorite stone for his statues from Magan, Ammon, copper from the Zagros Mountains, and gold and carnelian from the lands of the south. He describes purifying the city, creating a time of perfect peace and harmony before the first brick was laid. The slave woman was made equal to her mistress, he boasts. The slave was made to walk side by side with his master. For this sacred project, all social divisions were temporarily erased. And the statues. Gudea is most famous for the 24 or so magnificent statues of himself that have survived. They are masterpieces of Sumerian art, carved from that expensive imported black diorite, one of the hardest stones available. They were made to last for eternity. In every single one, he is depicted in a posture of serene piety. He is either standing or seated, his hands clasped in front of him in a gesture of constant prayer. His face is calm, his gaze steady. He often wears a distinctive, brimless woolen cap. These statues were not placed in his palace to glorify himself. They were placed inside the temples he built to stand as his eternal substitutes, forever praying to the gods on behalf of his people. One statue, known as the Architect with a Plan, is particularly fascinating. It shows a seated Gudea with a stone tablet on his lap. On the tablet is the engraved floor plan of the temple, complete with a stylus and a measuring rule. It is a direct depiction of the divine vision he claimed to have received, a perfect piece of royal propaganda connecting his real-world construction project back to its divine origins. A quirky and charming tidbit from his temple-building inscriptions is the level of detail he provides about the ritual process. Before he began construction, he had to perform a ritual brick-making ceremony. He personally mixed the mud for the first sacred brick, carrying the basket of clay on his head like a common laborer. He poured libations of honey and ghee into the foundations to sanctify them. And when the temple was complete, he organized a 7-day festival, a massive celebration with feasts and music, and declared a moratorium on all debts and legal disputes. He created a citywide holiday to inaugurate his life's work. But who was this man, really? Historians still debate the reality behind the pious image. Was Gudea truly this peaceful, beloved builder? Or was this image a carefully constructed persona, a political strategy to differentiate himself from the hated Akkadian model of the warrior king? His inscriptions are almost certainly idealized. He does mention, almost in passing, military campaigns against Anshan and Elam in Iran, so he wasn't a total pacifist. He was likely a shrewd political operator who understood that in the post-Akkadian world, the path to legitimacy and power was through piety, not conquest. By focusing all his state's resources on temple building, he wasn't just pleasing the gods. He was also acting as a massive state employer, stimulating the economy, and consolidating his own popularity and control. Gudea's reign represents the cultural peak of the Sumerian Renaissance. He created a golden age for his city of Lagash, a peaceful island of prosperity and artistic brilliance in a still unsettled world. His legacy is not one of empire, but of art, literature, and architecture. He showed that a king could be remembered as great not for the enemies he destroyed, but for the sacred houses he built. But this idyllic, city-state focus model was about to be swept away. The era of peaceful coexistence was ending, and the dream of a unified empire, the ghost of Akkad, was about to be reborn. Gudea's peaceful, pious reign in Lagash and Utu-Hengal's liberation of Sumer from the Gudeans set the stage for the final act of the Sumerian revival. But the future did not belong to the city-state model, however successful. The memory of the Akkadian Empire, the idea of uniting the entire land between the rivers under a single, centralized authority, was too powerful to forget. Sargon had created a template for empire that would haunt Mesopotamia for the rest of its history. And the man who would resurrect that template was Uar-Nammu, the former governor of Uar. After the liberator Utu-Hengal's accidental death, Uar-Nammu seized his chance. He was ambitious and capable, and he quickly consolidated his power, defeating the rival city of Lagash and establishing himself as the supreme ruler of a newly unified Sumer. But he didn't stop there. He went on to create what historians call the Third Dynasty of Uar, or the Uar Empire. This was the last, and in many ways the greatest, of the native Sumerian empires. You are now standing in the heart of Uar-Nammu's rebuilt capital, the city of Uar. And rising before you, dominating the skyline, is his most magnificent achievement, the Great Ziggurat of Uar. This was not just a repair of an old temple platform. This was a monumental new construction, a man-made mountain of solid brick, built on a scale never seen before. It had 3 massive staircase-adorned terraces, rising to a temple shrine at its summit, the earthly home of the city's patron, the moon god Nana. The lowest level was built of bitumen-mortared baked bricks, designed to be waterproof. The upper levels were sun-dried brick. Sophisticated weep holes were built into the structure to allow moisture from the core to escape, preventing water damage. It was an engineering marvel. This ziggurat was more than a religious building. It was a political statement. Its sheer size and grandeur proclaimed that Uar was now the center of the world, the heir to the ancient traditions of Sumer, but with a power and scope to rival the Akkadians. Uar-Nammu, like Gudea, presented himself as a pious builder king, but unlike Gudea, his ambition was imperial. He was blending the piety of the Sumerian Renaissance with the grand, centralized vision of Akkad. This is Akkad's most enduring echo, the very idea of a unified state. The Uar Empire was in many ways a recreation of the Akkadian system, but with a Sumerian face. Uar-Nammu and his successors, especially his son Shulgi, created the most intensely bureaucratic state the ancient world had ever known. If the Akkadians invented the filing cabinet, the kings of UR turned it into a supercomputer. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from this period have been found, recording in mind-numbing detail every aspect of the state-controlled economy. We have tablets that record the exact yield of a single sheep, the daily beer rations for a team of weavers, and the movement of individual bushels of grain from a field to a central storehouse and then to a temple for an offering. It was a command economy on an epic scale, a system of centralized planning that would have made a Soviet commissar blush. A mainstream historical fact from this period is the law code of Ur-Nammu. Though it's often overshadowed by the later and more famous Code of Hammurabi, this is the oldest surviving law code in the world. It's not a complete code, but a fragment, yet it gives us incredible insight into their sense of justice. Unlike the eye for an eye principle of later codes, Ur-Nammu's laws often prescribed monetary fines for offenses. If a man knocked out another man's tooth, he didn't lose a tooth in return. He paid a fine of 2 shekels of silver. It was a system based more on compensation than on retribution. The preface to the code is a beautiful piece of royal propaganda, where Ur-Nammu boasts that he has established justice in the land, protected the weak from the strong, and ensured that the orphan did not fall prey to the rich, the widow did not fall prey to the powerful. This, too, is a legacy of the Akkadian model. Sargon and his heirs were the first to position the king as the ultimate source of justice for the entire land, bypassing local city councils. Ur-Nammu perfected this idea, codifying it and presenting himself as the great shepherd of all his people. However, the ghost of Akkad also had a darker side. A quirky and telling detail is how Ur-Nammu died. Despite his image as a peaceful lawgiver, he died in battle, fighting against the Gudians who still troubled his eastern borders. In a poignant royal hymn, he is described as being abandoned on the battlefield like a broken pot. The hymn describes his spirit's journey to the underworld, where he makes offerings to the great heroes of the past, like Gilgamesh. The perfect, pious Sumerian empire builder met a violent end, just like an Akkadian warrior king. The dream of empire came at a cost. The Ur-3 dynasty would last for about a century, a brief, brilliant flash of Sumerian glory before it, too, collapsed under pressure from foreign invaders and internal decay. But the model it created, itself a refinement of the Akkadian original, would set the pattern for all subsequent Mesopotamian empires, from the Babylonians to the Assyrians. The true, lasting legacy of Akkad was not its lost city or its cursed kings. It was the idea that this land, this patchwork of cities and peoples, could and should be one. It was the invention of the imperial dream itself, a dream of unity, power, and order that would be pursued by countless kings for the next 2,000 years, a powerful, seductive, and often bloody echo in the long corridor of history. For more than 3,000 years, the stories we've been exploring of Sargon, Naram-Sin, and the lost city of Akkad faded from human memory. They survived only as distorted legends in the writings of later peoples like the Babylonians and Assyrians, and as brief, confusing mentions in the Old Testament. The cities themselves, Uruk, Ur, and the Phantom Akkad, were buried under mounds of earth, their ziggurats mistaken for natural hills, their languages and scripts utterly forgotten. The world of ancient Mesopotamia was lost. Its rediscovery is a story of adventure, obsession, and scholarly detective work that begins in the 19th century. You are now in the desert of southern Iraq in the 1850s. The political situation is complex. This land is part of the vast, decaying Ottoman Empire. But European powers, particularly Britain and France, are vying for influence. And one way they do this is through cultural prestige, through archaeology. The race is on to uncover the civilizations of the Bible. The primary goal is to find cities like Nineveh and Babylon, the famous capitals of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. The much older world of Sumer and Akkad is not even on their radar yet. They have no idea it exists. The pioneers of this era are a fascinating cast of characters. They are not today's meticulous, university-trained archaeologists. They are diplomats, adventurers, army officers, and spies, men with a passion for history and a talent for self-promotion. You see a man like Ptolemy Bata, the French consul in Mosul, digging into a massive mound he hopes is the biblical Nineveh. He finds a spectacular Assyrian palace, but it's not Nineveh. A year later, his British rival, Austin Henry Layard, a charismatic and relentless explorer, starts digging at another mound nearby, Nimrud, and then at a third, Kiyunjik, and hits the jackpot. He uncovers vast palaces decorated with incredible carved stone reliefs of kings, battles, and lion huts. And, most importantly, he finds a library. This is the great library of the last mighty Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal. In a single room, Layard and his team uncover over 30,000 cuneiform tablets. It is the single most important discovery in the history of Mesopotamian studies. These tablets are the Rosetta Stone for an entire civilization. The script, cuneiform, was a complete mystery. For decades, scholars have been struggling to decipher it, using trilingual inscriptions found in Persia. A mainstream historical fact is the Behistun inscription, a massive relief carved on a cliff face by the Persian king Darius the Great. It contained the same text in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, a later form of Akkadian. By first deciphering the simpler Old Persian, scholars like Henry Rawlinson, a British Army officer, could begin to crack the code of the impossibly complex Babylonian cuneiform. The discovery of Ashurbanipal's library provided the raw material to truly unlock the language. And as scholars began to translate these tablets, they realized they weren't just reading about Assyrian kings. The Assyrian scribes were antiquarians. They had copied much older texts. They found the Epic of Gilgamesh with its shocking flood story that predated the biblical account of Noah. And they found king lists and chronicles that spoke of even older, almost mythical dynasties. They found references to kings named Sherakin and Naram-Sin, and to a lost kingdom of Akkad. The legends were starting to resolve into history. While the north was yielding up the Assyrians, other explorers were working in the south. Men like William Loftus and John George Taylor, British diplomats, began excavating the huge mounds at sites they knew from local tradition as Warka and Mukayar. As they dug down, they found artifacts that were clearly much older and stylistically different from the Assyrian finds. At Mukayar, Taylor uncovered the corners of a massive brick structure. It was the Great Ziggurat of Ur. He found foundation cylinders placed there by a much later Babylonian king, Nabonidus, who would repair the ancient structure. The inscription on the cylinders mentioned the original builder, a king named Ur-Nammu, and his son Shulgi. The excavators had stumbled upon the capital of the Ur-3 dynasty. A quirky and rather charming detail from this pioneering era is how they transported their finds. Layard wanted to send his colossal human-headed winged bull statues back to the British Museum. These things weigh many tons. He had no modern cranes or heavy machinery. He did it the way the ancient Assyrians themselves might have, with sheer manpower. He had hundreds of local workers build a massive wooden cart, dig a ramp down to the palace floor, and then haul the statues out of the trenches with ropes and rollers, all while fending off local political intrigues. The whole operation was a monumental feat of engineering and diplomacy. The discoveries came thick and fast, but the picture was still confusing. Scholars noticed that some of the oldest tablets from the south were written in a language that was not Akkadian. It was a completely different, non-Semitic language. In 1869, the brilliant Franco-German scholar Julius Oppert, noticing that the kings often took the title king of Sumer and Akkad, proposed that this unknown language should be called Sumerian. Many of his colleagues thought he was crazy. That was just a strange, ceremonial form of Akkadian. The debate raged for years. It wasn't until the excavation of Gadia's city of Girsu by the French at the end of the century, which uncovered a vast trove of statues and tablets written almost exclusively in this other language, that the existence of the Sumerians as a distinct people and civilization was finally proven beyond a doubt. Historians still argue about the ethics of these early excavations. They were often little more than treasure hunts, focused on finding spectacular museum pieces. They destroyed as much as they saved, paying little attention to stratigraphy or the context of everyday objects. But without these swashbuckling, often reckless pioneers, The lost world of Sumer and Akkad might have remained buried, and this journey we are on tonight would have been impossible. They lifted the veil, and for the first time in millennia, allowed Sargon and Gudea to speak again. We've seen the grand sweep of history, the rise of cities, the clash of empires, the curse of kings. But what was it like to actually live in this world? Let's zoom in from the king's palace and the battlefield to the narrow, dusty streets and courtyards of a typical Mesopotamian town. Let's explore the strange, wonderful, and sometimes terrifying details of their daily lives, their beliefs, and their attempts to understand the world around them. You're walking through a residential neighborhood in a city like you are during the time of the Sumerian Renaissance. The houses are clustered together, made of sun-dried mud brick, their plain, windowless outer walls presenting a blank face to the street. This design offered privacy, security, and most importantly, relief from the blistering summer heat. You duck through a low doorway into a central courtyard, which is open to the sky. This is the heart of the home, the main living and working space. Rooms for sleeping, cooking, and storage all open onto this central area. Some wealthier homes might be 2 stories high, with wooden balconies overlooking the courtyard. The family is the core of society. Marriages were arranged, formalized with a legal contract written on a clay tablet that detailed the bride price paid to the bride's family and the dowry she would bring to the new household. A mainstream historical fact is that women in Mesopotamia, particularly in the earlier Sumerian periods, enjoyed a surprising degree of legal and economic rights compared to many later ancient societies. A woman could own property, run a business, and act as a witness in court. We have records of female tavern keepers, textile manufacturers, and scribes. While society was undeniably patriarchal, a woman wasn't simply her husband's property. Enheduanna's powerful position, while exceptional, was built on a foundation of recognized female agency. Now let's talk about health. If you got sick in ancient Mesopotamia, your first stop probably wasn't a doctor, but a magician or an exorcist, an Asapo. They believed that most illnesses were caused by supernatural forces, a sin you committed, a taboo you broke, or most commonly, the malevolent actions of a demon or an angry ghost. The Asapo would perform complex rituals, reciting long incantations to drive out the evil spirit. He might create a small effigy of the demon and then destroy it, or perform a kind of transference magic, drawing the sickness out of you and into an animal, like a goat, which was then driven out into the wilderness. Sound familiar? It's the ancient ancestor of the scapegoat concept. If the magic didn't work, you might visit a different kind of practitioner, an ASU, who was more of a physician. They practiced a form of herbal medicine, and their prescriptions, recorded on tablets, read like strange and unappetizing recipes. A poultice for a swelling might involve mixing turtle shell, salt, and beer. An internal potion could call for snake skin, powdered river shell, and oil. A quirky and rather disgusting tidbit is that their pharmacopoeia included a wide range of ingredients we would find revolting, such as dung from various animals, animal fat, and even urine. The line between medicine and magic was blurry at best. A prescription was often accompanied by a specific incantation that had to be recited for the cure to be effective. Historians still argue about the efficacy of these remedies. While some of the plant-based ingredients may have had genuine medicinal properties, the Mesopotamians had no knowledge of germs or anatomy. They never practiced human dissection due to religious taboos. Your chances of surviving any serious illness or injury were slim. Their view of the afterlife was equally grim. The Mesopotamian underworld, known as the land of no return, was not a place of judgment with rewards and punishments. It was a bleak, shadowy, dusty realm beneath the earth where everyone, good or bad, king or peasant, went after death. It was a miserable, boring eternity spent eating dust and drinking muddy water. The ghost of Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh describes it as a house of darkness, from which he who enters never goes out. This gloomy outlook perhaps explains their emphasis on living a full life on earth, having many children to continue your name, and being buried properly by your family, so your ghost wouldn't be forced to wander the earth, homeless and angry, tormenting the living. Despite this grim cosmology, they found joy in life. They loved music. We have depictions of people playing harps, lyres, lutes, and drums. They played board games. The so-called royal game of a beautifully crafted and laid board found in the royal cemetery, is a testament to their love of leisure. And they loved stories. The tales of heroes like Gilgamesh or the Epic of Creation, the Enuma Elish, weren't just for kings. They would have been recited in public squares and courtyards, a form of popular entertainment that also reinforced their cultural values and understanding of the world. Life was hard, often short, and shadowed by a fear of gods, demons, and a miserable afterlife. But it was also a life filled with family, community, music, beer, and the shared stories that made sense of it all. Our long journey through the rise and fall of Akkad is nearing its end. We've walked through the reed marshes at the dawn of time, witnessed the birth of cities and writing, marched with the armies of Sargon, and stood in the shadow of Naram-Sin's divine ego. We've sifted through the dust of collapse and seen the remarkable rebirth of Sumerian culture. Now, as the soft light of evening settles over our story, it's time to zoom out and see how the echoes of this incredibly distant world still resonate, often invisibly, in our own. You might think that a civilization that crumbled over 4,000 years ago, whose cities are buried under mounds of sand, is just a historical curiosity. A fascinating story, but ultimately irrelevant to your life as you listen to this right now. But you would be wrong. The foundations of our world, in ways both profound and mundane, were laid in the mud between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The ghost of Mesopotamia is all around us. Look at your watch or the clock on your phone. Why is a minute divided into 60 seconds? Why is an hour divided into 60 minutes? Why is a circle divided into 360 degrees? The answer is not based on some universal logic. It's a historical accident, a legacy of the Mesopotamians. They used a sexagesimal base 60 system for their mathematics and astronomy. While we use a base 10 system for most things, this ancient Mesopotamian system is so deeply embedded in our measurement of time and space that we still use it every single day without a second thought. Every time you check the time, you're using a counting system invented by a Sumerian scribe 5 millennia ago. This is a mainstream historical fact taught in schools, but its implications are staggering. This system was developed by their astronomers, who were also priests, to track the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, which they believed were omens from the gods. Their meticulous, nightly observations from the tops of their ziggurats led them to map the constellations and create the zodiac, another Mesopotamian invention that, for better or worse, is still with us in the form of horoscopes. They developed sophisticated mathematical techniques to predict eclipses and planetary movements. This fusion of religion, mathematics, and astronomy was the very beginning of the scientific tradition that would be inherited and developed by the Greeks, the Arabs, and eventually modern science. Think about the way our society is structured. The very idea of a written law code, a set of rules established by a central authority that applies to everyone, a concept pioneered by Ur-Nammu and perfected by later kings like Hammurabi, is the bedrock of every legal system on the planet. The concept that the state has a role in ensuring justice and protecting the vulnerable, as Ur-Nammu claimed in his preface, is a foundational principle of modern governance. The idea of an empire itself, a large state composed of different peoples and territories, the political model invented by Sargon, became the dominant form of political organization for much of subsequent human history, from the Romans to the British. Even our stories are connected. The tale of a baby hero set adrift in a reed basket to be saved and raised by a humble family, the story Sargon told about himself, echoes down through the millennia in the story of Moses. The great flood that wipes out a sinful humanity, survived by one righteous man on a boat who saves the animals, is not just in the book of Genesis. It's a central episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written 1,000 years earlier. The hero's quest for immortality, the wrestling with the meaning of life and death, the pain of losing a friend, these universal themes were given their first great literary expression in the tales told in the courts of Uruk and Ur. A quirky, and perhaps the most fundamental, legacy is the one we've been using this whole time writing. The simple act of making a durable record of a thought or a fact, an invention born out of the need to count sheep and barley in Uruk, is arguably the most important technology humanity has ever created. It allows knowledge to be accumulated, to be passed down across generations, to be debated and built upon. Without the invention of writing in that Sumerian mud, there would be no history, no science, no literature, no law, no scriptures. Our entire complex, information-based global civilization is built on that initial spark. So, as we prepare to leave ancient Mesopotamia, we realize we never truly leave it. Its ghost is in our clocks, our laws, our stories, and in the very letters on this page or the words in your ears. The people of Akkad and Sumer are not just characters in a bedtime story. They are our ancestors, not necessarily in blood, but in culture. They laid the first bricks of the vast, chaotic, and beautiful edifice we call civilization. Their triumphs and their failures, their brilliant innovations and their tragic collapses, are the deep, often unseen foundations upon which our own world is built. The world of Sargon and Gudea now begins to fade, the sharp edges of the ziggurats, and the dust of the battlefield softening into the quiet darkness of your room. The echoes of cuneiform scribes and their rhythmic tapping of reed upon clay dissolve into the gentle, steady hum of the fan. The vast, sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia recede, leaving behind only the comfortable weight of your blanket and the slow, easy rhythm of your own breathing. The empires have risen, and they have fallen. The kings have boasted, and they have been turned to dust, their great cities lost and found and lost again. All that immense struggle, all that ambition and fear has settled into a quiet story, a murmur from a past so deep it feels like a dream. Let the silence of those ancient, buried cities merge with the peace of your own night. There are no more battles to be fought, no more curses to be feared. There is only this moment of stillness, a gentle descent into rest. The great rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates flow on, no longer as sources of conflict, but as a soft, lulling sound, carrying you slowly, gently, toward the calm and restorative shores of sleep. The history is done. The journey is over. And now you can simply let go. What really caused the collapse of the world's first empire? In the stunning conclusion to Akkad Panorama, The Rise and Fall of Ancient Mesopotamia, we uncover the chilling final moments of a forgotten superpower. Was it climate disaster, divine punishment, or something far darker that wiped Akkad off the map? As we piece together lost clues from cuneiform tablets, abandoned cities, and ancient prophecies, a shocking truth emerges, one that could change our understanding of human history forever. Why has no trace of Akkad's capital ever been found? Who, or what, wanted this empire erased? This final part will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the origins of civilization.